Hello and welcome to this week's program. I'm your host, Ian Juby. This is the third in the Complete Creation series, part of an exhaustive look at the creation-evolution debate. Since the airing of the first two programs, I've had overwhelming response, literally. Had everything from creationists, Christians, theistic evolutionists, anti-creationists, atheists, and insomniacs screaming at me to get the rest of the series out there. So here we go. Last week we left off with the history of the old earth thinking and theology and where that came from, stemming primarily from one man, Sir Charles Lyell. And we're going to complete the look of that history, bearing in mind we are looking at the history of the old earth thinking and where it came from with Charles Lyell. Now, despite the evidence, a number of people have written to me and argued that the Niagara Gorge is still old. I would contend otherwise, as we saw in the previous program. The evidence speaks otherwise. Let's take a closer look at that evidence in just a little more detail. The geology of the Niagara Gorge is very interesting. Now, again, remember, Lyell was attempting to discredit the history according to Moses and attempting to determine that the world was older than Moses claimed, or specifically older than the 6,000 years that the Bible would claim the earth is and how old the earth is. Now, he did this by the erosion rates of the Niagara Gorge. He didn't measure them. He guessed. That's what he did. Now, interestingly, when you take a look at the Niagara Gorge, the top layers in the gorge is a thick limestone cap. That cap is considerably thicker at the current falls, and it actually thins just downstream from the falls, just past the Rainbow Bridge. Now, at the falls, it's about 27 meters thick. It's 90 feet. When you get down just past the Rainbow Bridge, it actually thins out to 14 meters thick. You need to understand the process involved here. As the water flows over the falls, the water splashes at the bottom and erodes out the softer shale, which is underneath the limestone. That shale erodes very easily. The limestone does not erode easily. However, when the shale is washed away, the limestone can't support itself and it collapses. And then it gets eroded away. So you have a process for forming the falls and forming the gorge, which then erodes backwards towards Lake Erie. Now, if you have a thinner limestone cap, that means you have thicker shale, which is more easily eroded, and the limestone cap will collapse quicker. What that means, in the past, we had faster erosion rates than today. Now, last week, I showed you the first drawing ever of Niagara Falls, showed you why it was accurate and why we can determine where the falls were in 1677 at the time of Hennepin's drawing, and that erosion rate, just in the 250 years or so, just in those years, the erosion rate was somewhere between 11 and 15 feet per year average. Now, today's measured rate is about 5 feet per year. This, of course, lines up with the thicker limestone cap. As we get closer to Lake Erie, the erosion rate will drop considerably. But in the past, the erosion rate of the gorge was faster, considerably faster, by possibly as much as a magnitude of 3 compared to today's erosion rates. Now, at this point where the limestone thins to about 14 meters thick, the gorge takes on a wavy appearance on its shorelines. Again, an indicator something changed there. There was a change in erosion rate. Now, when we get down farther downstream, you'll notice that the gorge narrows dramatically, anywhere from 3/4 to 1/2 of the distance across the gorge at the Horseshoe Falls. This is key. The flow rates presumably would have been the same. However, now those flow rates go through a narrower gorge, and thus erosion would be considerably faster still. But further downstream even more, you encounter what we call the St. David's Gorge. Now, this was really discovered when the railroad bridge was put in just upstream from the whirlpool in the gorge. And when they were drilling down for the piers and the pilings, they encountered what they called glacial gravels. And this was the remains of the St. David's Gorge. And taking a look at this map here, it is a previously eroded gorge. That's very interesting. But again, I'll come back to that later. What I want to focus on right now is the history of the old Earth arguments and where they came from. This previously infilled gorge, there's considerable debate about it. But what we can say is that it starts here at the Niagara Escarpment and works upstream where the Niagara River started eroding its way back from the Niagara Escarpment, encountered the St. David's Gorge. This is why it takes a sharp left-hand turn going upstream. It turned and followed this ancient gorge. Why? Simple. It was easy to erode. It was already eroded out. There was just gravels. So all it had to do was wash away the gravels. So clearly it's going to take a turn and it's going to follow the previous gorge upstream and make that part of the Niagara Gorge. Again, faster erosion rates, still more. As the farther you go downstream in the gorge, the faster the erosion rates got. We're not even talking 7,000 years here. We're talking maybe 2,000 years worth of erosion, and possibly even less than that. Now, the river eroded back to this point called Thompson Point, took a dog's leg, headed upstream. The whole point I'm making here is that the Niagara Gorge is young. All evidence points to it being a very young, rapidly eroded feature. Yet, Charles Lyell's uniformitarian principles still affect even today's modern geologic interpretation. Today's estimated age of the Niagara Gorge is 12,000 years old. This is strictly fiction. All the evidence points to an age down around the 2,000 to 3,000 year old mark. This is nowhere near 12,000 years. Yet, Lyell's uniformitarian principles are still influencing the modern science of geology, and I would say towards the falsehood, towards the untrue. It is not scientific, not scientifically supported to suggest that the gorge is 12,000 years old. All the evidence says it's younger. You want to believe it's older? That's fine, but you are believing it in spite of the evidence, not because of the evidence. Now, let's move along. Charles Lyell also visited another very famous Canadian feature. Now, this is the Joggins Fossil Cliffs on the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. And this is on the east coast of Canada. Now, I've spent hundreds of hours over 5 years studying these cliffs intently. Phenomenal geology, phenomenal fossil. It is a world-class fossil site. I do encourage you to go there. These cliffs are very dangerous. Don't hang around them too much. You'll need to be living in a military tank to be able to survive some of the rock falls that frequent the place. So do be careful, but it is well worth visiting. You'll please notice that the sedimentary layers have tilted to the south on roughly a 20-degree angle. I'm going to come back to all of this in a lot more detail later on, but right now, again, I want to focus on the history of the old Earth thinking and Lyell's insistence in twisting the evidence to make it line up with an old Earth. The Joggins Fossil Cliffs are famous for these upright fossil trees. Now, we call them polystrate. Creationists call them polystrate fossils. Poly for many, straight for strata. It cuts vertically through many strata. Now, clearly, This does not line up to long ages. If these rock layers are supposed to take long periods of time to accumulate and form, are we to expect that the top of these plants stuck around for hundreds, thousands, or maybe even millions of years while the sediments slowly accumulated around them? Nonsense. It's clear that they were rapidly buried, catastrophically. Nevertheless, is that what Lyell interpreted these fossils as? No. He interpreted them as plants that were buried in situ. By that, they were plants that were buried where they grew, in the position they grew. Now, interestingly, William Dawson, who was a very famous geologist here in Canada, and historically speaking, William Dawson was clearly heavily influenced by Lyell as well. Here's a drawing he drew right around that time, and shows an upright stump, and he's trying to argue that this stump was buried in place, buried where it grew. Interestingly, this very same drawing is listed on the Talk Origins website. William Dawson was a creationist, so Andrew McCrae likes to cite this drawing as Dawson claimed that this stump was buried in situ. So take a close look at this drawing. Here's the upright stump, and the stump has what is called a stigmaria. Now, the stigmaria, I happen to have one right here. It's the fossil root from the lycopods at Joggins, and the stigmaria has all kinds of pockmarks all over the roots, and here is the mold of one of those roots. You can see here the rootlets, which radiate out from each of those pockmarks. So it's a two-part root. You have the root and then the rootlet. You can see how they mate together, and the roots radiate out from it. The roots tell a story. Now, this is very important. Let's take another look again at Dawson's drawing, which McCrae repeats and claims that this is evidence the plant was buried in situ. First thing you'll notice, the root has been stripped clean of its rootlets. That tells you right away it was not buried where it grew. It has been transported, and when it was uprooted, the roots were stripped off it. I can verify that I have seen a number of roots like this at Joggins, where the root is intact when it's visible, but the rootlets are not. The rootlets have been stripped off. Sometimes the rootlets are there, yes, but sometimes they are not. So roots in place is not evidence of in situ growth. Now, in Dawson's drawing, some might argue that his drawing was simply not exhaustive or accurate. That's nonsense. Take a look at the drawing. He has dozens and dozens of rootlets drawn in. And as you can see, the rootlets are typically only 1 to 1.5 centimeters across. Yet he drew dozens of them in there, and not one of them are attached to a root. Okay, they're upright. That's a mystery, but it's a mystery for everyone. Why are the plants upright? And incidentally, these plants are not trees. They're giant hollow reeds. So the interesting thing as well at Joggins, you have lots of these what are considered ancient pine trees, the Cordiales, and these trees, in 5 years of study, I've only ever seen one that was upright, and it was only about this tall. All the others are prostrate. They are laid flat. So why did the giant, weaker, hollow reeds remain upright, while the Cordiales trees, which are solid wood, were flattened? Makes no sense, except in the light of a global flood. In a flood, this would explain, in part at least, why you have solid trees which have been laid flat, while simultaneously, for instance, at Coal Mine Point, you have calamites which are which are buried vertically, polystrate, through the layers that contain prostrate or horizontal pine trees. We're not talking millions of years here. We're talking catastrophic burial. It is nonsense to suggest that this was in situ growth. Now, some of the other stumps that Lyell and Dawson looked at were similar to this. This is an upright lycopod, beautiful specimen here. And if you look carefully, you can see it has a root coming down and then back up what would have been ground level. This is what Harold Coffin referred to in his 1968 Creation Research Society quarterly article on the Joggins Fossil Cliffs. This is negative geotropism. What that means is the root was apparently not influenced by gravity. It appears as if the root was floating in a mud slurry. It was not growing downward as we would expect roots to do, but instead it was pointing down and then floating back up above what would have been ground level. But the other surprise was underneath this stump is the cavity left behind by an inverted stump. Now, I'm not the only one to report on this. John Mackay, I asked him, he is a trained geologist. He has been studying the Joggins Fossil Cliffs for years. I asked him if he had seen any inverted stumps. He said exactly what I did. He said he saw several that were probably inverted stumps, but only one that he could definitively say was an inverted stump. And Harold Coffin, again in his book Origin by Design, also has a photograph of an inverted polystrate stump. So the roots intact, as this one has, are clearly not evidence of in situ growth. This upside down stump has intact roots, which are on the same bedding plane as other upright stumps. So clearly, being on the same bedding plane is not evidence of in situ growth. It has all the earmarks of evidence used by the anti-creationists to supposedly prove that these stumps grew in place. It has all the same features, but it's upside down. And last I checked, stumps don't grow upside down very well. Last I checked. So clearly, this was not in situ growth. Now, Lyell, instead of choosing the very obvious interpretation that it is a catastrophic burial, instead decided to argue that this was stumps that were buried in situ, and thus requiring long periods of time. Now, again, I'm going to come back to the Joggins Fossil Cliffs and all of this evidence in more detail later in the consequences of the old Earth segment. Moving right along, this is the Temple of Serapis, or Serapi, depending on who you ask and how you pronounce it. But this was as the best example for Charles Lyell. This was in the frontispiece in all the editions of his book, Principles of Geology. And this was to him the best example of uniformitarian processes. Now, he visited there in 1829, and as you can see on the pillars here, roughly about a third of the way up, you can see this gray area in the pillars. That is actually a whole pile of little etchings in the marble pillars. That was caused by a seashell called lithodomi. This little small brachiopod, when it anchors itself to rocks, secretes an acid which creates a small hole in the rock, or a small little borehole, little dimple. And so these dimples are clearly evident in the pillars. Obviously, the temple was not built underwater, so Lyell's point, which is correct, is that the entire land sunk below sea level, in this case the Mediterranean Sea. Sunk below, stayed there for a while, and then rose again. Now, to Lyell, this was just excellent. This was exactly what he wanted to see, because suddenly Noah's flood wasn't necessary anymore. It was no longer necessary for the water to rise. Instead, the land could sink, and then it could come back up again. So this was perfect. This was exactly what Lyell wanted and hoped that he would find, and he did find it. And I'm not disputing his claims here in that it's true. The land can subside, and sure, probably can deposit layers. However, the argument that this proves millions of years is, well, it's a non sequitur, first of all. But let's examine this using what we now know from the modern sciences of geology. There's a small problem for Lyell's hypothesis. He has the land subsiding. Fine, let's give him that. This cannot explain the stratigraphic record we see around the world. Now, what you're looking at here is a map of the Tapeats sandstone. Now, the Tapeats sandstone outcrops in the Grand Canyon. It's the very first layer. When you take a look down at the bottom, you see the Vishnu schist. That's the black rocks with all the wavy vertical lines. And on top of that is a layer called the Tapeats sandstone. Now, I am co-working with a number of other geologists around North America, and we are investigating the stratigraphic units throughout North America and correlating them. What that means is this sand outcrop, this sandstone outcrop, even outcrops right here in Ontario. So it doesn't just outcrop in the Grand Canyon, it outcrops over major portions of North America. So let's come back to this map. Again, I'm going to come back to the Tapeats sandstone later on in more detail because it's a fascinating study. But the Tapeats sandstone, as you can see by this map, covers roughly 1/3 of North America. Now, this sandstone will probably be found as well on the other continents. And what we are seeing is a consistent pattern of what is claimed to be basement rocks, gneiss, granite, schist, rocks like that. And sitting on top of that is this cross-bedded sandstone, very hard rock. And the point here is that if subsidence happened, we are talking at least 1/3 of North America subsided to produce that layer. Now, the thing is, as you can see here at the Grand Canyon, that layer is perfectly parallel to thousands of feet of other perfectly parallel sedimentary layers. So not only do you have to subside the Tapeats, you have to subside thousands of feet. A major portion, I would argue all of North America, has to subside thousands of feet without going out of level even 1 degree. If it had gone out of level even 1 degree, you would see it visible in those layers as a major change in thickness. In fact, within eyesight, it would change by hundreds of feet in thickness. It hasn't. Now, the Tapeats sandstone is not the only interesting one. Dr. Derek Ager, who was the president of the British Geological Society, now the late Dr. Ager. Derek Ager, in his book, The Nature of the Stratigraphic Record, and in his other monumental work, The New Catastrophism, where he accepts catastrophes but still adheres to the old Earth. I'm going to come back to that in detail later on. As Ager himself, an anti-creationist, he loved to hate creationists. And if you don't believe me, just read the preface and the introductions to his books. You'll quickly see what I mean. He hates creationists. It's not as if he's on our side. Nevertheless, as Derek Ager pointed out, the White Cliffs of Dover can be seen on the other side of the English Channel as the White Cliffs in France. That chalk layer actually covers major portions of the world. And again, that layer is parallel to all the other layers in the stratigraphic record. Now, when it leaves the White Cliffs of Dover, it goes west to Ireland, right over to the Mississippi embayment, and, of course, the Austin Chalks in Texas. Now, I've gotten to study the Austin Chalk in Texas personally, and will continue my studies there, but that's not where it ends. It also heads eastward from there to Bulgaria, southern USSR, and Turkey, and yes, it even outcrops down under as the Gingin Chalk in Australia. So now, not only are we subsiding North America, or England, we are subsiding pretty much every continent on the planet simultaneously. This is impossible tectonics. So you either have one choice or the other. Impossible tectonics, which have all of the continents subsiding simultaneously by thousands of feet, or you have the water rising thousands of feet. In either case, you have a global flood. I'm happy either way, because I believe in Noah's flood. So I don't care either way. But we're going to come back to this in a lot more detail later on in the program. Now, Lyell's book had a profound and significant impact on society. First of all, the entire point of the book was to discredit the history according to Moses. For whatever reasons, he choked on the idea of a global flood and had intention to disqualify the biblical account of a global flood. This book that he wrote, influenced countless numbers into thinking that the Bible was fiction. In actual fact, it was Charles Lyell's conclusions that were fiction. No one stopped to address or to counter Charles Lyell's arguments. Most people couldn't. In his day, very few people had seen the Niagara Falls or could go to study it. It wasn't until long after Charles Lyell's time and the profound influence of his book that the original work he accomplished was addressed and actually refuted. Now, one of those people that got a hold of Charles Lyell's book and was influenced by it was a young man, no other by the name of Charles Darwin. You see, in Darwin's day, there were plenty of evolutionary theories, but they all required vast amounts of time. The thing is, everyone in Charles Darwin's and Lyell's day knew that the Earth was young. So these evolutionary theories were simply rejected out of hand because they required vast amounts of time and just simply wasn't there. Charles Lyell's book gave Darwin the old Earth framework he needed for his evolutionary theory. So a few years later, after being influenced by Lyell's book, Charles Darwin went on to write his book, Origin of the Species, and which still, to this day, continues to turn the world on its head. I'm your host, Ian Juby. I'm going to sign off for this week. Hope you'll join us for the next program as we examine these consequences of an old Earth and as it pertains to evolution, creation, and the origins controversy. Hope you enjoyed the program, and hope you'll enjoy me for the next one. Bye-bye for now.